Hey, I'm Dr. Dave Hayes and doing a Ukraine update. We aren't doing them too often. And honestly, the war moves at such a slow pace that, you know, I think that's generally a good idea. However, here we are, December 18th. Trump has been, was elected now a little coming up more than a month ago. And a lot of things have happened though, right? And the strategic situation around the world had a dramatic shift with the fall of Syria, which is a major Russian client and kind of puts Russia on the back foot in a lot of ways. It also puts Iran and its axis of resistance, as it's called, also in a bad position. And so we have a lot of strategic action that kind of is in contrast to the slow, very slow grind on the ground. And so, where are we? And I just at the end of the year want to take just a step back and say, um, I if we went back to the summer, right? In the summer, Ukraine was working really hard to fix its manpower problems, right? Because it's just a big fact, an enduring fact in this is Ukraine's biggest problem is manpower. In the summer, at one point, there was an ammo shortage that got settled. Manpower is their biggest problem. They had an initial burst of volunteers that manned them up and gave them the army they have. But as the war is going on, as often happens with democracies, right? Happened in the US with the Civil War, happened in World War II. After a couple of years, the verve, the volunteers, they dry up. And now you've got to conscript people. Ukraine has been very reluctant to lower its conscription from 27. They don't bring in 18-year-olds like we used to. 27 was it. And so they were lowering that and that was supposedly going to fix things. They also had their invasion of Kursk and they were taking the war on the offensive and so things looked very rosy. If you go back, and in fact, just the other day, I listened to a War on the Rocks podcast with one of the participants had just been in Ukraine visiting the front line, and he had a very, very pessimistic view. He said, the fix of the manpower, it didn't happen. Kursk, they're being pushed back in Kursk. They've got one main supply line. We don't know. And kind of the feeling was that while Russia has long term problems, right, the war is not really sustainable for Russia for a lot of reasons we're perhaps more familiar with because we like running down Russia. Ukraine is having these other difficulties, and they were kind of pessimistic, right? And so beginning November, they were kind of worried about how long the Kursk salient would hold out, what would happen. You fast forward a month, right? And what happened in that time? In that time, Syria collapses, right? And the Russians are on the back foot. And the North Koreans, yeah, sure, they were in the beginning of November. They were new, they were coming in. Yeah, sure, but they weren't a big deal. The Kursk salient. It's been a lot of people will say, "Oh, Russia has taken back from the initial gains in Kursk that the Ukrainians made. They've taken back an area the size of Singapore," which I would point out, Singapore is not the biggest place to, but they still hold a significant portion of that area, and the Russians have been committing forces, and the Ukrainians have been tearing them up. Tank losses are really mounting, and there's increased kind of effort to count. People are looking at satellite images of the three main storage yards where the Russians keep their Soviet era, their reserves of tanks, and the parking lots are empty, right? And so they're running out, and their losses have been very, they've been very, they've lost a lot in Kursk. So they still have the manpower problems. The war on the ground, which at one point, there was in November, these guys, there was some kind of concern. Yeah, this is not going well. Well, it's stabilized a bit. Now we look at Russia and we see that Russia is having all these problems in Syria, and they are losing a lot of their strategic position around the world. And so we're kind of seeing this. strategic situation change. At the same time, Ukrainians now have the ability to fire our weapons as deep as they want. They have been attacking consistently with drones. And so we're seeing that the war is maybe not as pessimistic as possible. We're also, the other big fact is that Donald Trump is now president. And when we look at the situation, I would say my thinking on this is, um, I feel like we are moving into an era or a time span where negotiations might occur, right? Russia is having enough trouble. They are not gonna be able to keep this going on for long. They've probably been hoping that Trump would come in and pressure Ukraine, and he still might. But at the same time, the Ukrainians are not so pessimistic, and this was one thing I think it was Martin Hoff on the War on the Rocks podcast. He had just come back, and Donald Trump had just been elected, and he'd been in Ukraine. He said, they're really not that worried about it, you know. Um, and so I think that when it comes to Trump, we have to keep in mind that yes, he has said he would end the war in 24 hours, and that of course is ridiculous, right? By his claims, he's already not done it, right? He said, "I even before I'm elected, I'll do it." All right, that's. However, Trump very clearly wants to settle this war, right? And he wants a negotiation, and he is certainly going to be moving in that direction. The It looks to me like the Russians and Ukrainians are both realizing that there is not a way that they win, right? Because kind of the idea is you get peace negotiations when both sides are stalemated, when they see in front of them is indefinite fighting and losses. Therefore, and if one of them thinks that, hey, if we just push a little harder, we can do this offensive or we can do that thing and we can win. And both sides seem to be realizing that that's just not going to happen. Russia, even uh, ISW has noted that they've kind of given up on trying to have big maneuver moves, right? And they're into this slow grind. Ukraine, for its part, it's harder to say. They're always going to say, no, we're never going to give up. We're going to fight. But they have not, Kursk was their big move. And they are stretched thin and they are with their manpower problems that haven't been helped by taking over Kursk. I think it's probably clear to them that they are not necessarily they can't get a knockout blow. Right. And so what you do see, I think the thing about Ukraine is while there's a stalemate on the ground, Ukraine is constantly doing things strategically, attacking Russian oil reserves, assassinating. They've started a campaign of assassinating people, and it looks like they have. They've done it in a couple of cases. There is some analysis that says this is a campaign to make the Russian supporters of Putin, the key figures in Putin's regime, realize that they are vulnerable. And that would say, hey, look, you don't want this to keep going on forever because we'll start plinking you guys. A more violent form of, we do targeted sanctioning. We say, oh, you're a supporter of Putin, we're going to lock up your bank accounts. The Ukrainians have another idea, right? They go in a different direction. And that could be part, again, of putting that pressure on. So I think it's going to come down to this: how this strategic situation evolves, how each side evaluates its chances in a war versus what it can get on the negotiating table. And both sides, though, have a really big problem. Russia has said they're going to take Luhansk and Donetsk, and they've annexed Zaporizhia and Kherson. And they're committed to that. Putin's boxed himself in. They're going to have to give up a part of that, right? But they've declared it Russia. So that on Putin's side is difficult because he has these very maximal aims. On the Ukraine side, they're going to have to give up their aspiration of freeing Crimea, bringing their whole country back. And so that is going to be for both sides the problem that they have to move in to accept that. And I'm not saying it's good. I think the best thing would be for Ukraine to win. But if you're gonna have negotiated settlement, that's what it takes. At another level, I think there's also a factor in this is going to be Trump's role, right? Trump, I am as I'm thinking about it, he is very committed to having a negotiated settlement. He is not himself capable. I mean, he thinks that he can just get in and talk to people and through his own personal magnetism bring them to the table and they'll all love him and and it's bullshit. Okay, I'm sorry. That's my professional judgment. However, he's the goddamn president of the United States. He does have a lot of power. And if somebody could come to him with a plan, right, this is the thing I'm thinking is if somebody comes to him with a plan that says, hey, let's do this, that, and the other thing, and you do this, and well, somebody who's got the brains to do it, whether it be Macron, whether it be someone in his administration. Macron, I'm watching him. Um, he knows how to play Trump, right? That one of the best things to happen in Ukraine was Trump going to the Notre Dame opening and Zelensky being there. But my point is that if you could tell Trump, hey, just you know, outsource this thing, and we're going to put your name on it, like every Trump thing that somebody else builds it and puts Trump's name on it, right? If you had that, Trump could be a very useful I want to say a useful idiot, but he could very much be part of that. And I think that if there is a negotiation, I don't see how Trump doesn't get his name on it in some way because someone's going to need him to come in and play a role. And there's a lot that we could imagine happening on that side. And so I think that to a certain extent, Trump is going to be in play here. The question is the Trump manipulation. Can somebody like Macron manipulate him? On the downside of it is it might be somebody like India or China might try to be a third party negotiator and see a path to being in it. And if they threaten to alienate or cut Trump out, that could be a problem. So there can be downsides to this, but that's where I see the situation right now in big pictures. Sorry, went a little long on that, but there is actually a lot going on.